Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Personalization Outbreak Podcast. The world of higher education is changing dramatically with the rise of AI and new leadership models for educators. In today's episode, we're going to talk about how to create an inclusive learning environment that embraces differences in people and sets students up for success in their future workplace. Our guest, Dr. Paul LeBlanc, is the president of Southern New Hampshire University, the largest nonprofit provider of online higher education in the country. Paul is also the author of two books, Students First, Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education, and the book Broken, How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us. Now together, we're going to talk about how to create a more inclusive learning environment through empathetic leadership and explore how higher education leaders can best prepare today's students for their future careers. Now, before we get started, please click the like button below, share it with your colleagues, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and social media at Llopis. Let's get started. You are listening to Personalization Outbreak, a podcast about the collapse of traditional corporate standards in today's more personalized world. I'm Llopis. I'm a leadership strategist, author, contributor to Forbes, and founder of the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement. On this show, I'm interviewing executives across multiple sectors to find out how the balance between standardization and personalization can exist. Now, welcome to the show, Paul. I was excited to get to know you. I know we, had a chance to get to know each other a little bit before our interview today, but I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thanks so much for having me, Glenn. It's a pleasure.
Well, look, being the largest nonprofit provider of online higher education in the country, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And I'm sure that everybody kind of wants to know what you're doing, why you're doing things the way that you're doing. But I actually want to, and we're going to get to all that, but I want to start with you as an individual. So you immigrated to the United States as a child. In fact, you were the first person in your extended family, Paul, to attend college. So what inspired you to embark upon a career, not just to reinvent the meaning, but the purpose for higher education?
It's a great question. We immigrated from Canada, from the area that some people would call sort of French Appalachia. It's very, very poor, Eastern Canada, which is the poorest section of the country. My father had an 8th grade education, my mom 6th grade. It was a hard scrabble, kind of subsistence level farming village, right? Still outdoor plumbing, a well instead of a tap at the kitchen, that kind of thing. And my mom worked in a factory until she was in her 70s, and my dad was a construction worker, day labor, essentially. And I was the first in my family to go to college. And in some ways, the reinvention question you ask is about a rediscovering for me of what was made possible. And what was made possible for me, and I apologize if it's not schmaltzy, was the sense of the American dream, how this kid from a pretty poor, economically poor family, immigrant, didn't speak English as my first language, spoke French, learned it in the houses where my mom was a cleaner. She worked 2 jobs, so she also cleaned houses. So she'd plunk me down in the libraries of these beautiful homes in Weston, Mass, and put kids' books in front of me. And that's how I learned English. And yet I look at my daughters' lives, and they live a life that my parents could scarcely imagine. And what made that life possible was access to high quality, affordable education for me. It changed the trajectory of my whole life, and every generation in my family after will be affected by that. And what I fear is that American dream, and again, this is the schmaltzy part, that American dream is less and less available to a lot of people in our country. In a world in which our society is becoming more inequitable, it's too expensive, it's not relevant, it doesn't work for them, it doesn't recognize so many of the learners that we care about. So that's the reinvention we're doing is actually about rediscovering what I think is higher ed's central mission in our world, which is to create social mobility and, by extension, social justice and opportunity for people who are otherwise going to get left behind. And that's a pretty bad place to be in America today if you don't have opportunity.
Boy, I connected with you on so many levels because my parents were immigrants from Cuba, all in.
Yeah.
Of course, I was born here in the United States, but I was raised to think like an immigrant, and we don't have to go on this topic of affirmative action unless you want to jump in. But we all know what happened in the Supreme Court, and in fact, I'm writing an article about this right now in Forbes and asking myself, I think it's time to share the story because, number one, do people think I'm Hispanic? Did people realize the opportunities that were given to us because of that? But just knowing that, the demographics have changed, how we view the world changed, the workplace is changing. And, to think that you did something of that opportunity that was given to you, I really think this is the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one that I think has been lost in narratives. And one, as you mentioned, is, the value of higher education. So, again, you're the largest online higher education institution in the country. How do you find yourself competing with narratives that maybe aren't focused on the things that we actually should be rewarding in higher education?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question when I think about who we serve, and it's always my important starting point, is I always say we serve the 45% of Americans who say that they would struggle today to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair or medical bill. Like, that's how precarious is their life. So our students easily get knocked off track. Our students is a 30-year-old with 3 kids and a dead-end job, some credits from when they tried college. 18% of our students are military, so maybe they get some credits when they were in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. But now they're stuck. And what they realize is, I got to get that credential. I got to get that post-secondary credential in order to create opportunity so I can take better care of my family. These are not people they're not entitled. They're not looking for handouts. They're right. What they want, though, is a higher ed that actually works for their lives. And what does that mean? It means that they don't have the privilege of waltzing onto a campus as a 17-year-old and taking 2 or 4 years or more to get their degree. Like, that's how we think of the American college student. Our student is that person who's supporting their family. And increasingly, they're 17, 18, and 19-year-olds, but they're the ones who don't have the income or the means to be on a campus, a residential campus. So they're looking for models. And that means we really have to rethink how we offer what we do. We're online, not because we're, technophiles. We're online because that's what works really well for a working adult. In the old model, they would have to go to an evening program on a campus. That meant racing from work, grabbing a fast food dinner, eating it in the parking lot, going to class, typically for 2 or 3 hours, maybe missing your kid's bedtime. And then you get home and you're exhausted and you get up and do it again. And what I realized when I wrote my book, Students First, is that time itself is a source of inequity. Poor people have less time. They have less control of time. There are broad swaths of the American workforce where people can't tell you today what their schedule is next week. And if I can't do that, how do I commit to being on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock on campus? So we went to online because it's more convenient. I can come home, have dinner with my family, catch my child's soccer game, help them with their homework, tuck them in bed. And then when I log on to SNHU's portal at 9:30 p.m., for the next 2 hours, I'm a college student. And it works better in my life. We also looked at what's the friction that gets in the way of adult learners, even things we just take for granted. You're transferring credits from someplace. We say, traditionally, hey, you need to contact the registrar's office. You need to get certified copies of your transcripts so we can evaluate how many of those credits will count, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't been in college for 15 years. What's a registrar again? Oh, and by the way, I just got out of work at 5. They're already closed. So we do all of that for them. Like, we built administrative processes to take the friction out of the system because our learners need all the help they can get. It's not hand-holding. It's building a system that's very responsive to their needs. And I think, traditional higher ed has worked exceedingly well for those of us who have the opportunity, but we need new models for a new world of learners, a new workforce. I was a 17-year-old white male. I may not have had much money, but I had some sources of privilege. And I think, for so many of who, I'll just finish the answer to this question with Cedric. So Cedric is a truck driver from Mississippi, of a very poor African-American community in which he lives. He drives an 18-wheeler for 14-hour shifts. And at the end of those 14-hour shifts, he would pull into a rest area and try to park as close as possible to the rest area to get their Wi-Fi signal, because in the cab of his truck, he would log on and become an SNHU student. He just marched across the stage last month, 2 months ago, got his diploma from me, and now works as a drug rehab counselor. And, he created opportunity for himself. But we have to build a higher ed system that works for the Cedrics of the world. Like, Cedric isn't going to a campus. He's on the road. He's 8 states away. So can we build a system that works for him? So that's really been so the narrative we sometimes get is, oh, you're online, you can't be good quality, or you're online, but you're so big, you must just be a factory. And what those narratives miss, and I think you looked at my book, Broken. I'm really fascinated in scale systems of care, whether it's healthcare or K-12 or criminal justice or substance abuse or mental health. And the innovators that are doing great work in this space have realized you have to sort of start with what are the human relationships that are most important, and then scale everything else. And in our model, we really built around the relationship of a student and his or her advisor. And that advisor stays with you through the whole journey. So if Cedric's in that truck at night, it's 9 o'clock, and he's logged on in a rest area and stayed far away from home, he can text his advisor. Hey, Glenn, I'm really struggling with my stats course. Like, can you have any advice for me? And I go back like, hey, Glenn, yeah, not a problem. Let me connect you with, we have a tutoring center. We got tutors who specialize in stats. I'm going to connect you with it. Look for the email from me, blah, 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 right? So it's this very powerful model, but it's built around human relationships. And that's why people aren't just a number in this big scale 185,000 student operation. Because we know you, we see you. The we in this case is your advisor, that human being that's representative. And what we know from all the work, and I spent a lot of time talking to sociologists and psychologists and others, is that you need one person who believes in you and who's there at your side. And almost all of us have had more than one of those. Like, I could list for you the great mentors, teachers I had, sponsors who brought me along. But I love the work of Donna Beagle, who writes about extreme poverty. What she will say is that no one who escapes extreme poverty ever cites a program, a platform, a government policy, a system, or an agency. You know what they cite? A person. Somebody who believed in them and helped them get the path out. And that's our philosophy to this.
Well, and to do that, you mentioned something that really resonated with me, is that you're responding to student needs. You're not reacting. And right. I see this a lot in higher ed, where, now we're reacting to things that maybe we had considered in the past. And now we finally realize that there's urgency, because we've stifled more than unleashed the individual student. And you unleash when you respond, not react. And so when going back to your book, and this was your second book, called Broken, How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us and How We Can Fix Them, you associate leadership with humanity, love, and the importance of making sure that students matter as individuals. Why is this so important to you? And maybe you can tie this back with how the entire online learning platform has evolved because of it.
Yeah, and if you go back to the previous question, I think, in my research around Book Broken, and the first chapter is called Mattering. And it's influenced by the work of Greg Elliott, a sociologist at Brown University. And he talks about mattering as, it's more than that sense of belonging. Like, you and I belong to organizations, and I value that because I like their conference or I like their monthly publication, and they value me because I send them a check. But I don't feel like they know me. Mattering is about, like, do I actually know you as an individual, as a complex human being? And it's two other things. Do I also invest in you? And for a lot of that people, it's simply, do I invest my time? My great teachers, my mentors, were not my mentors, and they weren't so influential on me because of what they did in class. It's the time they gave me outside of class. It's the conversation in their office over a cup of coffee. It's them not waiting for me to raise my hand and say, can I talk to you because I don't know what to do next? It's them saying, hey, Paul, I want to talk to you about what you're doing next. like proactively getting ahead of it and like, wow, you're interested, right? Like I knew I mattered to them. The second was not just investing their time, but investing their resources. It was my great professor, Helen Heineman, who, when she realized I wasn't planning on going to grad school, like, I'm a working class kid. I'm just lucky to get through college. It's like, like we have to talk about that. And then made a phone call to Boston College where she basically said, hey, I know it's the 11th hour. You got to get this guy in. And it was, her personal relationships that she brought to bear. I think what we know, for example, for populations of employees who have been historically underrepresented is it's not enough to mentor. You have to be an active sponsor. We talk about sponsorship. And then the last thing Greg Elliott talks about is if you really want people to matter, they have to feel like their presence actually shapes or influences or sets direction for your organization. So we do this with our employees, for example, at SNHU. We're the only university in the country to be on the Chronicle of Higher Ed's Best Colleges to Work for list for 16 years in a row. There's no other university. Our employees love working for us. And one of the reasons is that when they say, hey, we don't think this works, we actually do something about it. They see their input. So Greg would say, you treat your employees like human beings. They feel like you know them. They don't feel like a number. You invest in them, their time, programming, et cetera. But they also see their ability to have influence, to have agency, because we don't want to be part of a machine. We want to be part of an organization that feels like we matter to them and they matter to us, and we have agency and influence in that, right? So I think that's a really important and powerful part of what we do and why we do it. And when I wrote about it, it was really uncomfortable to write about love and leadership. Like most leadership books don't talk about love, from what I can tell. But it started with the question. The impetus of this book was I was working my first book, and I was distracted by a question. I said to my wife, I wonder if higher education can learn to love its students again. And she said, well, did it ever? And it's like, honestly, I felt loved if you define love by people took their time, they got to know me, they invested in me. I felt like I mattered in their world. And the second chapter of the book, as you know, Glenn, is about aspiration. And they helped me dream bigger dreams. And when you think about that, then it's about leadership. It's like, I want my employees to dream bigger dreams for themselves. I want them to dream bigger dreams for my organization. I want them to push us to be better than we are today. I want to invest my time in them because I know if I do that, they'll invest their time back in us and back into my organization. So love matters a lot in this work. And it's interesting how much it has resonated with readers. Like I get these amazing notes from people who say, like, I'm embarrassed I never use this word, but I love my people. And I put time, and if you drill under, it's not some mamby pants, it's not romantic love, it's not some feel-good, engaging thing. It's like, no, like, I know who they are. Let me give you one example, and then I'll stop because it really, my daughter, there's a wonderful guy named Will Zemp who worked for me for a long time. He's now leading a big project in North Carolina called Project Kitty Hawk. He's one of the most decorated people who's fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. My daughter was embedded with his unit, 101st Airborne, in Iraq during the war. She was a photographer. And she said, when she went back to interview Will's men, they never were happy again with another officer after they had him. He was redeployed someplace else. And the reason is they felt like he actually knew them. He knew who was having trouble at home. He knew whose kids were acting up. These guys were on a forward operating base in Iraq, but he was making sure that they got on a phone call to talk to a daughter who had just had some traumatic, right? And to this day, for the 44 guys who were killed under his command, he goes to high school graduations of their sons and daughters. He makes sure there are gifts under the tree. Like, he loved his people. And the military has this great phrase, your soldiers won't care how much you know until they know that you care.
Exactly.
Right? Think about that. They won't care what you know till they know that you care. And I think leadership today in a world that feels so disjointed, where people feel really off kilter post-pandemic and everything else that's going on, you almost have to start with love. You have to start with, yeah, it matters to me that we're in this conversation today, Glenn. Like, I'm all yours for the time that we have together. I'm not thinking about something else. I'm not distracted looking at my phone. Like, no, I'm present. I'm actively listening, and I'm going to do everything I can to make you a better version of yourself. And that's the second chapter of the book in some ways.
Oh, I'm inspired, and but I'm also reflecting because, as you all know, the workplace today corporate America is changing so fast. And as much as people are talking about investing in their employees, quiet quitting, all these things that have happened, which, by the way, I don't think that those are new things. They've just been rebranded. These things have been happening for quite a while. But I hear you talk about that level of intimacy, that level of love and care. But today you hear employees say, if I was given the opportunity to have 3 weeks off, I would feel incredibly stressed. That's the exact opposite of what you're talking about. So given what you've learned in your views on leadership and what matters to people, how would you guide or at least help a senior leadership team put their arms around what you're talking about? And if I could just say one thing, where am I going with this? You're talking about leaders that have learned how to lead a certain way for so long that all they know is those old, outdated standards of command and control.
Yep.
Now the individual is asking loudly, what about me?
Yeah.
So how do you get them started? Because I can tell you this, there's a huge void, and you know this, between caring about people making the numbers and caring enough about somebody that they can get through the day.
And it's interesting because the reality is, and we know this from the research, and there's a great book called Scarcity that looks at the cognitive science of scarcity, is that if I'm an employee, if I'm on a team and my team is worried about getting through the day, there's no way in hell they're going to make the numbers. I can force them all I want. So it's actually more productive, more powerful if I can, when I can get people feeling empowered and feeling safe and well cared for, like, the old expression, hurt people, hurt others. I also think that flip is true, which is love people, love others, cared for people, care for others. I think the reason that we have such great success with our students, 94% of them say if they were to do it again, they'd come back to SNHU. 94% said that if they were recommending a university to a family member or a colleague or a friend, they would recommend SNHU. It's extraordinarily high. Our NPS scores are off the map. And I think that's so. I think it ties exactly what I said. We're the best college to work for. Like, our people feel really empowered and deeply believing in our mission. And it extends, and our students are the benefit of that. And our numbers and our performances are great as a result. So if you're a team.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
I think if you're thinking about this as, leadership team, we've done a lot of work. We continue to work with the Center for Creative Leadership out of Greensboro. I'm sure you're familiar with them. They're a kind of global organization. And I was really struck by something that they brought to us some years ago, which is the old models of command and control. They're kind of based on industrial and military models, top down. Universities, by the way, we talk in an egalitarian way. We're very hierarchical and very siloed. And we're exactly the same. The dean decides this, the associate dean, the process, it's very up and down. But what they argued is that modern organizations in this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, a term taken from the military, really have to operate differently. They have to be more fluid. They have to be shape-shifting. And they really argue for the next organizational model, it's like Buddha's path to enlightenment is a network of networks. So my leadership team, we have moved now more emphatically to having almost no operational decisions in front of us. When we meet, we are actually talking about strategy, threat, some opportunities, crisis management, culture. But we have pushed decision-making down to a series of councils that are all in conversation with each other. They're a network of networks. And depending on what's happening at any given time, they rise up in prominence and importance, or they move down. They're never not important, but the organization shifts and it's responsive, right? And it can respond much more agilely than a traditional. And this, so books like Humanocracy describe this kind of organization. Unleashed by Francis Frage, who was brought in from Harvard Business School to help Uber when the culture collapsed. Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams. These are all books about rethinking the modern organization. So you stay very crystal clear on your mission and on your end goal, like where you want to end, but you give your people a lot more power and agency about how they get there. And in the military notion, as McChrystal describes, what they realized is that in Iraq, they were seeing stuff they had never seen before. It was crazy. And the people who were war planning up here had no sense of it. So what they realized is we got to let the people on the ground, give them a lot more flexibility about how they navigate, but be really clear about what the end goal is. So they call it commander's intent. So Glenn, this is what I need you to do. I'm giving you a ton of leeway how you get your team there, how you deliver on that. What do you need from me? And you get to say, well, boss, I need to not ask me to do X, Y, and Z anymore, because that's just getting in the friggin' way. And B, get me these resources because I can move out and make that other department, that other unit operate differently. That happens every day in most organizations. And your people will tell you how much wasted effort they have in satisfying things that aren't about the goal. So if you know the work of David Graeber, I'll finish with this, but David Graeber, who's one of my favorite, he's passed away about 1.5 years ago, but he's an anarchist economist. He's an interesting combination. And he was one of the, intellectual godfathers of the Occupy movement, whether you like it or whether you like that movement or not. But it's part of this sense of the world is changing and people are demanding something different from us. And his last book was called Bullshit Jobs. And what he reports is that globally, about 60% of people believe that if they stopped doing their job tomorrow, no one would notice. In the US, it's a lower number. It's about 35%. But if you dig in and ask people how much of your day is on the important work and how much on your day is on the bureaucracy, just the stuff that the system asks you to do, it's pretty depressing. And I think for any leader, really getting down to understanding, are we doing work that actually improves the bottom line, the experience of our customers, the experience of our patients, our students, whatever, and how much of our people's work is satisfying our own internal processes and bureaucracies that we spin up, that leaders create to make themselves important. And there's more of it than we think. And I like to think we're pretty good on this front, but I pulled together our advisors. Remember I said these academic advisors who are at the core of our success, and they were great. And I asked them one day, I said, if you think about your week, what percentage of it is spent on students and getting them to the finish line? And what percent is satisfying SNHU's bureaucratic internal processes? I didn't love the answer. Even the places like thinking about this in the way we are, there's still too much. And a simple example, God, if I want to take a PTO day, I've got to go through 5 steps. Yeah. I was like, and it takes X amount of time. It's that's idiocy. So this is where we can use technology and scaling to say, no. Let's make that a 1-step push of a button so you can get back to work with students. If they are doing course planning, it takes them a lot of time. It's a manual process. In the next 12 months, we're going to use AI to do that. You don't need to do that. We'd rather have you in conversation with a student, not do the preparatory work that allows you to have the conversation.
So before we go to AI, because I'd like for you to close with AI, Paul, what you just did so eloquently is helped us understand, number one, that the forces of personalization and standardization are operating at the extremes and how we can begin to find balance. That's what you just did. And I think that this is where what organizations are in search of, but they don't know how. You just gave them a little mini masterclass of how. So as we close, Paul, take us through AI. I mean, clearly, higher education needs to start evaluating not just the pros and cons of AI, but what this all means of what's in the best interest of the student. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'm spending more and more of my time on this question, so much so that I met with my board and said I am giving 70 to 80% of my operation responsibility to my university provost because this is the most important work I will do with whatever time I have in this role. This changes everything. I think it changes everything in society, and thus it changes everything in higher education. It's going to have a dramatic impact on workforce. It's already happening. And to the extent that universities have as one of their not the only, but one of their primary jobs is preparing people for the workforce, what are the jobs? What are the jobs that are going to be, And I just wrote a piece about this for Le Monde in France, which is looking back at the Industrial Revolution. You could sort of think about jobs in 4 categories. Jobs that get obliterated, jobs that were untouched, they're on the extreme ends. So if you're a dancer, you're probably not worrying about AI.
Right.
If you're a low-level knowledge worker, you probably should be really worried about AI.
Yeah.
If you're a software coder, I'm not sure programming's got much of a future. And then there are two categories in the middle. The first category are jobs that remain, but they get pretty dramatically altered by AI. So we're going to see AI. Everyone's going to have an algorithmic coworker. You'll have an algorithmic assistant at work and probably at home. If you play with Pi, for example, it's kind of your AI in your pocket. You can just ask it questions in this very natural way. And then there are going to be jobs that don't exist today. So there are 800,000 openings for AI-related jobs right now in the US. So even though we talk about the job loss in the tech sector, it's actually way outweighed right now by the creation of new jobs related to AI. So big shifts in the workforce. But there's a more fundamental existential shift underway, which is that we live in a knowledge economy and universities create knowledge workers, and universities are themselves a knowledge industry, right? So what we do, we are all about what's important. And in some ways, it's way oversimplifying, but you go to college to answer a question. What do I need to know in order to be an X, fill in the blank? What do I need to know to be an accountant? What do I need to know to be a nurse? What do I need to know to be a police officer? We're now entering into an era when knowledge is always only a set of prompts away on our device. And as a result, it's way less valuable. Like we're not going to pay for a lot of knowledge work that we can now just automate and do this way. And what I argue in Broken is that we're going to have to shift to much more human-centered skills, competencies, and value. So our value may not be in processing tax returns. Like I think that's just going to be automated, right? I think we're going to need a small percentage of the accountants that are currently employed today. I think that's a job category that's going to be deeply disrupted. And PwC just announced they're spending over $1 billion on AI. It's not to spend $1 billion on top of all the accountants they pay for. In my view, they won't say this, but my view is they're just going to start to rethink their business. However, we have enormous needs for human-centered jobs that AI can't do. Like we should be flooding our schools, which are really poor performing on any international measure. We should be flooding our public schools with great teachers, great social workers, great counselors. We have decimated our mental health care system at a time when mental health is crisis level proportions in America. We should rebuild our mental health care system. We should rebuild our inner cities. We need to rebuild infrastructure. We have an aging population and no coherent system of geriatric care. A looming disaster. None of that's going to get done by AI. All of that are human jobs. The problem is we live in a society that doesn't give much value to those jobs, doesn't like to pay for them, and tries to get as many of them out of the system as possible. We want fewer of everything. The reality is that's not going to work. And when we see enormous percentage of the workforce displaced, we're going to have to rethink how we think about these things and how we pay for them and how we value them. But it is the path to a human-centered future in which we let AI do the low-level and mid-level knowledge work, and where we have much more focus on the things that actually matter, which is the care of each other in a society that works for everyone. And I think that's my optimistic view of what AI could look like. We're struggling, however. We didn't get it right with social media, and we paid a terrible price as a society, a terrible price, right? And I think AI is going to make social media look like a day at the beach, a garden party, if I can mix my metaphors. It's so we've got to get ahead of this. And I think there is an opportunity to do that work.
Paul, what a pleasure it's been to get to know you. And your insights clearly have articulated that we got a long way to go. Yeah. And what does this mean? As you showed us today, you need to stay on top of what's relevant. 2, you have to continue to make yourself more relevant to solve for those relevant topics. And 3, you have to be in touch with the very people that you're here to serve. Because how are we going to strengthen humanity to take all of these evolving interconnection parts into the future? And that's exactly what you're doing. And so I greatly appreciate your time. I greatly appreciate your wisdom. And thanks again for being on the show, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Glenn. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
And as we end every show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. Thanks again, Paul.
Thanks for listening to Personalization Outbreak. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. If you enjoyed the content, visit ageofpersonalization.com to check out our free streaming video series and learn how to get involved in the movement. I'm Glenn Llopis. I wish you a good day, and remember, without strategy, change is merely substitution, not evolution.